If a dog refuses to move forward, it is never hesitation. It is recognition of something the human eye has forgotten how to see. The words seem to hang in the cold morning air as retired United States military veteran Jack Turner stands at the edge of a dense forest ridge somewhere in the rural Pacific Northwest. The ground beneath him is uneven, covered in pine needles and old earth softened by recent rain. Mist clings low between the trees, turning the entire landscape into a shifting gray corridor with no clear beginning or end. Beside him stands Shadow, a fully grown German Shepherd military working dog with a black and tan coat, upright posture, and eyes that remain locked forward with unusual intensity. He is not pacing. He is not distracted. He is refusing to cross. Jack tightens his grip slightly on the leash, then relaxes it again, noticing that pressure has no effect on the dog's decision. Shadow's body remains perfectly still, positioned just before a narrow forest path that breaks away from the ridge line and disappears into deeper woodland. There are no signs, no markers, no indication that anything important lies ahead, yet the dog's attention is absolute. Jack exhales slowly, scanning the environment. The forest is quiet in a way that feels deliberate, as if sound itself has been softened by something beyond natural explanation. A distant wind moves through the treetops, but it does not reach the ground where they stand. Shadow suddenly shifts his weight forward by half a step, then stops again, ears rotating slightly, as if capturing a frequency too faint for human perception. Jack kneels beside him, placing a steady hand on the dog's shoulder. "What are you hearing?" he asks quietly, though he knows there will be no verbal answer. Shadow does not respond with movement or sound. Instead, his gaze locks more precisely into the direction of the forest path, as if confirming a fixed point within the invisible depth ahead. Jack follows that line of sight, but sees only trees, fog, and uneven terrain fading into gray distance. Yet something about the alignment feels intentional, as if the path itself is pointing rather than simply existing. He stands slowly, adjusting the strap of his worn field pack, then takes a cautious step forward. Immediately, Shadow lowers his stance and plants his paws firmly into the ground, refusing to follow. The message is clear without being spoken. Do not move yet. Jack pauses, studying the dog's behavior with the kind of attention learned from years in the field where instinct often preceded intelligence. There is no fear in Shadow's posture. There is certainty. The forest ahead does not feel dangerous. It feels aware. Another faint shift in the wind passes through, and for a brief moment, Jack swears he hears something beneath it. Not a voice, not an animal, something more structured, like rhythm hidden inside silence. Shadow's head tilts slightly at the exact same moment, confirming that whatever is present is not imagined. Jack slowly lowers his flashlight even though it is still daylight, as if acknowledging that visibility has already become irrelevant. The path ahead remains unchanged, yet its presence now feels heavier, as though it has been waiting longer than it should have. Shadow takes one small step forward and stops again, locking his gaze deeper into the forest. Jack follows the direction one more time, and this time, he notices something he did not see before. The path is not natural. It is aligned, and whatever lies beyond it is not simply hidden in the forest. It is positioned. Jack Turner remains standing at the edge of the forest ridge, watching Shadow with a growing sense that the dog is not simply reacting to instinct, but responding to something structured within the environment itself. The narrow forest path ahead continues to disappear into a corridor of dense trees and shifting mist, but its presence now feels less like a natural opening and more like a deliberate passage that has been waiting to be noticed. Shadow remains locked in place, his body angled precisely toward the path, ears subtly adjusting, as if tracking a pattern hidden beneath the silence. Jack slowly steps forward half a pace, then stops again when Shadow does not follow. The German Shepherd does not move backward or forward. He holds position, maintaining an exact line of attention that feels increasingly intentional. Jack lowers his gaze to the ground, noticing how the soil along the edge of the path is slightly compressed compared to the surrounding forest floor. It is not the random disturbance of wildlife or hikers. It appears measured, almost organized, as if repeated movement has followed the same route over time. He kneels briefly, brushing aside a layer of pine needles, revealing a faint indentation that runs parallel to the path. It is subtle but consistent, suggesting repeated passage rather than isolated events. Shadow suddenly shifts his head slightly to the left, reacting to something Jack has not yet noticed. Jack follows the dog's focus and raises his eyes toward the trees. Between the trunks, the fog appears to thin in a controlled line, forming a narrow visual corridor that aligns directly with the path ahead. The alignment feels unnatural, as if the environment itself has been shaped to guide observation in a specific direction. Jack stands slowly, adjusting his grip on the leash, but Shadow remains steady and unmoved. Another faint sound passes through the forest, similar to wind but structured in intervals too precise to be random. It travels in a pattern that repeats once, then fades, then repeats again, always originating from deeper within the same direction. Shadow responds instantly, taking one cautious step forward, then stopping again at the exact same threshold. Jack studies him carefully, recognizing that the dog is not resisting movement but regulating it, as if waiting for confirmation before proceeding further. The forest path ahead remains unchanged visually, yet its presence now feels increasingly defined, almost engineered in perception. Jack exhales slowly, feeling the weight of the moment shift from curiosity to quiet certainty. This is not a path discovered by chance. It is a direction that has been consistently reinforced through subtle environmental cues. Shadow finally turns his head back toward Jack for a brief moment, making direct eye contact before returning his focus forward. There is no urgency in his behavior, only confirmation. Jack tightens the strap of his pack and takes a careful step forward again, this time aligning himself fully with the path. Shadow does not move immediately. Instead, he waits until Jack is exactly positioned behind him, then begins to walk forward at a slow, deliberate pace. The forest seems to narrow around them as they proceed, not physically, but perceptually, as if attention itself is being drawn into a single corridor. Jack realizes that whatever lies ahead is not simply a destination hidden in the woods. It is a point of convergence that both man and dog have been guided toward through signals neither of them fully understand yet. Jack Turner and Shadow continue deeper along the narrow forest path, which now feels less like a natural trail and more like a controlled line cutting through the dense woodland. The surrounding trees grow closer together, their branches forming irregular overhead patterns that filter the daylight into fragmented layers. The mist thickens slightly as they move forward, reducing long-distance visibility and reinforcing the sense that the environment is guiding attention inward rather than outward. Shadow leads at a steady pace, but his movement is no longer exploratory. It is precise, as if following a sequence already understood. Jack notices that the ground beneath them changes subtly in texture. The soil becomes firmer, more compact, and the pattern of fallen leaves appears disturbed in a consistent directional flow, suggesting repeated passage along this exact route over time. There are no visible footprints, but the compression of the terrain implies that something has moved here frequently enough to alter the natural settling of the forest floor. Jack slows slightly, observing Shadow's posture. The German Shepherd's ears rotate once, then stabilize forward again, locking onto a point deeper within the forest corridor. Jack follows the line of attention, but sees only more trees, mist, and narrowing perspective. Yet the sense of alignment persists, as if the path itself is subtly reinforcing direction through environmental consistency rather than visual markers. A faint sound emerges again, similar to earlier but more structured in rhythm. It does not travel randomly through the air but seems to repeat at measured intervals, each cycle slightly more distinct than the last. Shadow reacts immediately, pausing mid-step before continuing forward without hesitation. Jack tightens his grip on the leash but does not restrain the dog, instead matching his pace to Shadow's controlled movement. The deeper they go, the more the forest appears to organize itself around their trajectory. Tree spacing becomes slightly more uniform, and the curvature of the path reduces irregular deviation, forming a clearer directional channel. Jack begins to recognize that this is not accidental geography. It feels shaped by repetition, as if countless subtle interactions over time have reinforced this exact route. Shadow suddenly stops again at a point where the path briefly widens before narrowing once more. He stands still for several seconds, focusing ahead without blinking. Jack steps beside him and looks forward, noticing that the mist in this section behaves differently. It does not drift randomly, but appears to flow in a consistent direction, converging toward a single unseen focal point further ahead. The air feels quieter here, not in absence of sound, but in controlled reduction, as if external noise is being filtered out naturally. Jack exhales slowly, sensing that the forest is no longer simply surrounding them. It is guiding them. Shadow takes one measured step forward, then another, resuming movement with calm certainty. Jack follows, now fully aware that their progress is no longer driven by exploration alone, but by a sequence of subtle signals embedded in both environment and instinct. Whatever lies ahead is not revealing itself all at once. It is unfolding in alignment with their approach, as though their presence has activated a path that has always been waiting to be completed. Jack Turner and Shadow continue deeper into the forest corridor, where the narrow path now feels increasingly engineered in its consistency, as if the environment itself has been subtly shaped to guide movement toward a predetermined destination. The trees on both sides stand closer together than before, their trunks forming a more deliberate boundary that reduces lateral deviation and strengthens the sense of forward direction. The mist thickens again, but instead of obscuring everything evenly, it appears to form a gradual gradient that draws visibility toward a single vanishing point ahead. Shadow leads without hesitation, his pace steady and controlled, no longer reacting to small environmental variations, but instead following an internal certainty that Jack can no longer dismiss as coincidence. Jack adjusts his breathing as he walks, scanning the terrain carefully. The forest floor here shows a more pronounced pattern of compression, not in scattered footprints, but in a continuous directional flow, as if repeated passage has shaped the ground over an extended period of time. Fallen branches are consistently displaced toward the same edges, reinforcing the impression of long-term guided movement through this exact route. Shadow suddenly slows, then stops again, this time holding position longer than before. His head tilts slightly upward, focusing on something beyond the immediate line of sight. Jack steps closer and follows the dog's gaze, noticing that the density of mist ahead begins to thin in a structured way, revealing faint vertical lines in the distance that do not belong to natural tree formations. The alignment is too precise, too geometric to be random. As they approach, the shapes resolve slowly into the outline of a structure partially obscured by the forest canopy. It is tall and vertical, with a narrow silhouette that rises above the surrounding treeline. The form is still partially hidden by fog and branches, but its presence is unmistakably artificial. Shadow takes one step forward, then another, maintaining complete focus on the structure ahead. Jack follows closely, feeling a subtle shift in the atmosphere as they move into an area where the forest seems to open in a controlled manner rather than a natural one. The spacing between trees increases slightly, forming a clearer visual corridor leading directly toward the structure. The sound pattern they have been following becomes more defined again, repeating at consistent intervals, now clearly originating from the same direction as the structure. It is no longer ambiguous or environmental. It feels intentional and localized. Jack slows as they reach the edge of a clearing. The structure ahead becomes fully recognizable as a fire tower, rising from the forest floor with weathered but intact supports. It stands isolated, yet perfectly aligned within the natural opening that surrounds it, as if the forest itself has been arranged to frame its presence. Shadow stops at the base of the clearing, refusing to move forward immediately, his posture steady and focused. Jack stands beside him, looking up at the fire tower, noticing that despite its age and apparent abandonment, it does not feel neglected in the traditional sense. It feels observed, maintained by something beyond immediate visibility. The wind passes through the upper structure, producing a faint resonance that matches the rhythmic pattern they have been tracking. Jack tightens his grip on the strap of his pack, realizing that the path did not simply lead them through the forest. It led them precisely to this point, where silence and structure converge in a way that suggests purpose rather than chance. Jack Turner stands at the edge of the forest clearing, his attention fixed on the fire tower rising above the tree line like a silent structure suspended between past and present. The wooden frame is weathered, yet intact, its vertical lines cutting through the surrounding mist with an unnatural sense of precision. Despite its appearance of abandonment, the tower does not feel forgotten. It feels positioned. Shadow remains at the base of the clearing, unmoving, his entire posture directed upward toward the structure. There is no hesitation in him now, only focus, as if the tower itself is the endpoint of a signal he has been following since they left the ridge line. Jack slowly steps forward into the clearing, his boots pressing lightly into the damp ground. The environment here is different from the forest corridor behind them. The air feels thinner, more still, as if natural movement has been reduced to allow uninterrupted perception of the structure ahead. He tilts his head upward, studying the fire tower's silhouette. The ladder extends vertically into the mist, disappearing into the upper platform where visibility is lost. There are no visible signs of decay that match the surrounding forest conditions. Instead, the structure appears selectively preserved, as though maintained despite its isolation. Shadow suddenly shifts position, walking in a slow circle around the base of the tower. His movement is controlled and deliberate, not exploratory but observational, as if confirming structural consistency from multiple angles. Jack watches carefully, realizing that the dog is not reacting to the tower as an object, but as a source of something continuous. A faint sound returns, carried by the wind, but no longer random in pattern. It rises and falls at consistent intervals, aligning with the subtle rhythm they had been tracking through the forest. Jack exhales slowly, recognizing that the sound is not coming from the forest itself, but from above. He places his hand on the lower support beam of the tower. The wood feels solid, but beneath its surface there is a subtle vibration, barely perceptible yet undeniably present. It is not structural instability. It is resonance. Shadow stops his circular movement and positions himself directly facing the base of the ladder, lifting his head slightly, as if evaluating the ascent. Jack follows his gaze upward, where the ladder disappears into mist. The higher structure remains hidden, but its presence feels increasingly defined by sound and alignment rather than sight. The wind shifts again, and for a brief moment, the surrounding forest becomes completely still. In that silence, the rhythmic pattern becomes clearer, as if the tower itself is transmitting or receiving something through the environment. Jack tightens his grip on the strap of his field pack, understanding that the path did not end at the clearing. It only changed elevation. Shadow takes one step closer to the ladder and stops, waiting. Jack looks at him, then at the structure above, realizing that whatever they have been following through the forest was never meant to remain on the ground. It was always leading upward, toward a vantage point that has been quietly holding its position, long after it was thought to be empty. Jack Turner stands at the base of the fire tower, his gaze slowly moving upward along the weathered wooden structure as the mist thickens around its upper frame. The tower no longer feels like a simple abandoned lookout point. It feels like a vertical extension of the same pattern they have been following through the forest, as if the path itself has shifted from horizontal movement to vertical ascent. Shadow remains motionless beside the ladder, his posture steady, eyes locked on the point where the structure disappears into fog. There is no hesitation in him, only a calm certainty that the next step is upward. Jack takes a slow breath and places his hand on the ladder's lower rung. The wood is cold and solid, yet there is a faint vibration beneath the surface, subtle but rhythmic, as if the entire structure is resonating with something deep within the landscape. He tests his weight carefully before beginning the climb. Shadow watches closely, then steps forward and follows, placing his front paws on the first section of the structure's base support with controlled precision. Jack climbs slowly, rung by rung, maintaining steady movement while keeping awareness of both the environment and the dog below him. The forest around them begins to shift in perspective as elevation increases. Trees that once formed a dense corridor now spread outward in irregular patterns, revealing a wider expanse of land that had previously been hidden by canopy and fog. The air becomes noticeably cooler and thinner, and the sound pattern they had been tracking grows more distinct, now clearly aligned with the structure itself rather than the surrounding forest. Shadow remains directly beneath Jack, tracking every movement upward with unwavering focus. His ears rotate slightly at intervals, reacting to subtle changes in the sound frequency that now appears synchronized with the tower's vertical structure. Jack pauses briefly midway, gripping the ladder and looking outward through the mist. From this height, the forest no longer feels chaotic or random. It appears organized in subtle geometric patterns, as if shaped by unseen influence over long periods of time. The clearing below looks smaller, but more defined, and the path they followed is now clearly part of a larger alignment that extends beyond what ground-level perception allowed. He continues upward, reaching a section where the wooden beams feel reinforced, less weathered, as if maintained or replaced at some point despite the tower's supposed abandonment. The rhythmic vibration intensifies slightly here, still subtle but more structured, almost like a coded pattern embedded in the architecture. Shadow remains calm but alert, adjusting his stance below as if mirroring the changes in structural resonance above him. As Jack nears the upper section of the tower, the mist thickens again, partially obscuring the platform ahead. The sound pattern becomes clearer still, no longer just rhythmic but directional, as if guiding attention toward a specific point at the top. He tightens his grip and climbs the final stretch, understanding that whatever lies ahead is not a continuation of the forest path, but a shift in perspective that only becomes visible from this elevation. The tower is no longer just a structure they discovered. It is a position they were brought to occupy, step by step, through a sequence that has been unfolding long before they arrived. Jack Turner reaches the upper section of the fire tower, where the ladder transitions into a narrow platform partially wrapped in mist and weathered metal framing. As he steps onto the platform, the world below shifts into a wide, silent panorama of forest stretching endlessly in all directions. The elevation changes everything. What once felt like isolated terrain now reveals itself as part of a larger, interconnected pattern of landforms, tree lines, and subtle clearings that align in ways he did not notice from the ground. The air here is colder, thinner, and carries a faint resonance that seems to vibrate through the structure itself rather than the environment around it. Shadow remains below for a moment, then follows with careful precision, stepping onto the lower support area beneath the platform. His presence is steady and controlled, his gaze immediately fixed outward rather than upward, as if interpreting the landscape from both levels simultaneously. Jack moves slowly toward the edge of the platform railing and grips it with one hand, scanning the horizon. From this height, the forest is no longer chaotic or dense. It reveals itself as structured in subtle geometric flows, with natural formations that appear unintentionally aligned toward specific directional points. The mist moves differently at this elevation, no longer drifting randomly, but instead forming faint streams that seem to converge toward distant zones beyond visual clarity. The rhythmic sound they had been following throughout their journey is now unmistakably present at this height. It is no longer just a pattern in the environment. It feels like a structured signal embedded within the air itself, repeating at precise intervals that correspond with the physical resonance of the tower. Jack closes his eyes briefly, listening rather than observing, and realizes the pattern is not external to the structure but integrated into it. Shadow shifts his stance below, tilting his head slightly, as if confirming the same realization through instinct rather than analysis. The dog's focus remains locked outward, not on Jack, but on a distant section of the forest that appears visually unchanged yet feels distinctly different in presence. Jack opens his eyes and follows that line of attention. At first, he sees only forest, mist, and layered distance. Then, gradually, a subtle variation in terrain becomes visible. A section of land far beyond the immediate clearing appears slightly elevated in a pattern that does not match surrounding geography. It is faint but consistent, as if something beneath the surface is shaping the land above it. The fire tower itself seems to respond to this realization. The faint vibration within its structure becomes more synchronized, as if the tower is part of a larger system that extends far beyond its physical frame. Jack steps closer to the railing, adjusting his stance to maintain balance while continuing to observe. Shadow remains still below, maintaining alignment with the same distant point. The silence at this height feels different now, not empty but regulated, as though sound has been reduced to only what is necessary for recognition. Jack slowly begins to understand that the fire tower was never just an observation point. It functions as a reference position, a fixed vantage within a larger system of alignment that connects ground-level patterns with elevated perception. The forest below is no longer just scenery. It is a mapped structure of signals, and the tower is the point from which those signals become visible. As he stands at the edge of the platform, Jack realizes that the view is not revealing something new. It is revealing something that has always been there, waiting for the correct elevation, the correct perspective, and the correct alignment between instinct and observation to finally be seen. Jack Turner remains at the edge of the fire tower platform, his hands resting on the cold metal railing as his eyes continue scanning the distant forest below. The elevated view no longer feels like simple observation. It feels like exposure to a larger structure that has been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the correct height and perspective to become visible. The landscape stretches outward in layered formations of trees, valleys, and subtle clearings that now appear less random and more intentionally arranged. The mist continues to drift in controlled streams across different sections of the forest, and Jack notices that these streams seem to converge toward specific points far beyond normal geographic expectation. Shadow remains steady on the lower section of the tower, his posture unchanged but his attention fully locked on the same distant direction Jack has been observing. The dog does not move or react impulsively. Instead, he maintains a sustained focus, as if confirming a pattern that exists across both instinct and environment. Jack slowly shifts his stance and leans slightly forward, narrowing his focus toward a distant ridge line that appears subtly different from the surrounding terrain. It is not immediately distinct in shape, but its alignment breaks the natural randomness of the forest layout. It feels positioned within the landscape rather than formed by it. The rhythmic sound they have been tracking becomes clearer at this elevation, no longer masked by environmental noise. It is steady, repeating at consistent intervals that correspond with the faint structural vibration of the fire tower itself. Jack realizes that the sound is not localized to the tower alone. It is part of a larger system that extends outward into the landscape, connecting multiple unseen points across the forest. He takes a slow breath, absorbing the realization that the tower is not an endpoint but a reference node within a broader network of alignment. Shadow suddenly shifts his head slightly, adjusting his gaze by a few degrees to the left, as if correcting a calculation only he can perceive. Jack follows this adjustment and notices a second subtle formation in the distance, where the tree density changes in a controlled pattern that mirrors the earlier alignment he observed from the platform. It is not identical, but it is related, as if both points are part of a repeating structure across the terrain. The air at this height feels different again, carrying a faint sense of pressure that rises and falls in coordination with the rhythmic signal. Jack grips the railing more firmly, not out of fear, but out of the need to steady his perception as understanding begins to settle. The forest is no longer just a natural environment. It is a mapped system of signals, alignments, and repeating patterns that only become visible when observed from this exact elevation. Shadow remains still, continuing to watch the same distant direction without breaking focus, reinforcing the idea that this recognition is not solely human interpretation. It is shared awareness between instinct and analysis. Jack slowly turns his gaze across the wider horizon once more, and for the first time, he understands that what they have reached is not simply a vantage point. It is a threshold where perception itself changes, and where the forgotten structure of the landscape begins to reveal its intended design. Jack Turner stands at the edge of the fire tower platform, his perception fully adjusted to the elevated perspective that now reveals the forest as a structured system rather than a random, natural environment. The wind moves gently across the open height, brushing against the metal railing and wooden beams, creating a subtle layered resonance that aligns with the rhythmic signal they have been tracking. Below him, Shadow remains on the lower section of the tower, perfectly still, his body oriented toward the same distant direction Jack has been observing. There is no restlessness in the dog, only sustained focus, as if maintaining contact with a continuous signal that does not weaken with distance. Jack slowly shifts his gaze across the horizon again, refining his focus on the distant ridge line that first appeared subtly misaligned with the surrounding geography. Now, under sustained observation, the irregularity becomes more apparent. It is not a disruption of the landscape, but a structured deviation, as if the terrain has been shaped according to a repeating design rather than natural formation. The mist continues to move in controlled streams across the valleys, and Jack notices that these streams appear to converge toward multiple distant points, each one faintly aligned with the same directional pattern he has been following since they entered the forest. He tightens his grip on the railing, not from instability, but from cognitive pressure as the pattern begins to extend beyond single-point recognition. It is no longer about one structure or one signal. It is about repetition across distance. Shadow suddenly adjusts his stance below, shifting his head slightly to the right, then holding still again. Jack follows this adjustment and notices another formation in the far distance, similar in structure to the first but positioned along a different segment of the horizon. The consistency between these formations suggests a broader system, one that spans multiple sections of the landscape without breaking pattern continuity. The rhythmic sound intensifies subtly at this elevation, not in volume but in clarity, as if the height has filtered out interference and allowed the underlying structure of the signal to become more defined. Jack realizes that what he is hearing is not environmental echo, but organized repetition embedded into the landscape itself. He slowly exhales, scanning the entire visible horizon from left to right. The forest, which once appeared chaotic and unstructured, now reveals a distributed pattern of alignment points, each one faint, but connected through consistent spacing and directional flow. It is not a single phenomenon. It is a system distributed across geography. Shadow remains locked in position, continuing to track the same distant alignment without breaking focus. His stillness reinforces Jack's growing understanding that this recognition is not purely analytical. It is shared perception between instinct and observation, between human reasoning and canine detection. Jack steps slightly closer to the edge of the platform, lowering his center of gravity as he studies the convergence points more carefully. The fire tower beneath him feels less like an isolated structure and more like one node in a wider framework of elevated observation points, each potentially connected through the same unseen pattern. The wind shifts again, and for a brief moment, the entire horizon seems to synchronize in silence. In that silence, Jack understands that the view from the tower is not simply revealing geography. It is revealing design logic embedded within the natural world, a system that has remained unnoticed until the correct elevation, alignment, and attention brought it into clarity. Jack Turner remains at the upper platform of the fire tower, his attention fully absorbed by the expanded horizon that now reveals itself as a structured network of repeating alignments across the forest landscape. The initial sense of discovery has shifted into something deeper, a gradual realization that what he is observing is not isolated or accidental, but part of a continuous system extending far beyond a single viewpoint. The wind moves slowly around the tower, passing through the wooden frame and metal supports, creating a soft layered resonance that continues to match the rhythmic signal they have been tracking since entering the forest. Below, Shadow stands in perfect alignment with the same distant focal direction, his posture unchanged, his focus unwavering. There is no uncertainty in his behavior now. Every subtle movement he makes is deliberate, as if confirming an understanding that does not require verbal interpretation. Jack scans the horizon again, noting how multiple distant ridge lines and forest breaks now appear to form a repeating geometric distribution. These are not identical formations, but they share consistent spacing and directional orientation, suggesting intentional placement rather than natural randomness. The mist continues to flow in measured streams across the valleys, and Jack observes that these streams appear to follow the same directional logic, converging and dispersing at predictable intervals that mirror the alignment points he identified earlier. He exhales slowly, feeling the weight of perception shift again as the pattern expands beyond visual confirmation into structural certainty. Shadow suddenly adjusts his stance below, rotating his head slightly before locking onto a new point further along the horizon. Jack follows this adjustment immediately and notices another distant formation that mirrors the previous alignment structures but exists further along the same directional axis. The repetition confirms that the system is not localized but distributed across distance, extending across multiple zones of terrain without breaking continuity. The rhythmic sound intensifies subtly once more, not in volume but in definition, as if each layer of elevation has stripped away interference and revealed a clearer underlying signal. Jack now understands that the sound is not originating from a single source, but is embedded within the environment itself, expressed through spatial repetition rather than physical emission. He steps closer to the railing, adjusting his stance as he studies the full breadth of the visible landscape. The forest is no longer perceived as chaotic natural growth, but as a layered system of coordinated points, each one contributing to a larger structural logic that spans beyond immediate perception. Shadow remains steady, continuing to track the same distant alignment with complete focus, reinforcing the shared nature of this recognition between instinct and observation. Jack begins to understand that the fire tower is not an isolated vantage point, but part of a broader network of elevated positions that may exist throughout the region, each one serving as a reference node within this hidden structural framework. The wind passes through again, and for a brief moment, the entire horizon appears to stabilize into a unified stillness. In that stillness, Jack recognizes that what he is witnessing is not the discovery of something new, but the revelation of something that has always been present, carefully distributed across the landscape, and waiting for the correct perspective to be understood. Jack Turner remains at the upper platform of the fire tower, his perception now fully immersed in the expanded understanding of the landscape as a structured system of repeated alignments and distributed reference points. The initial moment of discovery has evolved into sustained observation, where each new detail reinforces the realization that the forest below is not random, but organized through a logic that spans distance, elevation, and directional flow. The wind continues to move around the tower in soft, layered currents, passing through the wooden beams and metal supports, creating a faint resonance that remains synchronized with the rhythmic signal embedded within the environment. Shadow stands motionless on the lower platform, maintaining perfect alignment with a distant focal point that neither shifts nor fades, as if anchored to something beyond visual confirmation. His posture is steady, controlled, and unwavering, reflecting a state of focused awareness that mirrors Jack's own growing certainty. Jack slowly scans the horizon again, noting how multiple alignment points across the forest now appear interconnected rather than isolated. Each formation he observes is not identical, but each shares proportional spacing and directional consistency, suggesting a distributed framework rather than individual occurrences. The mist continues to flow across the valleys in controlled streams, and for the first time, Jack recognizes that these streams are not simply reacting to wind, but following defined pathways that correspond with the same structural logic as the terrain below. He exhales slowly, adjusting his stance near the railing as the full scale of the pattern begins to stabilize in his understanding. Shadow suddenly shifts his head slightly upward and to the right, locking onto a more distant segment of the horizon that had previously blended into the broader landscape. Jack follows immediately, refining his focus and noticing another faint but distinct structural variation within the tree line. It is not abrupt or visually dramatic, but it breaks natural continuity in a way that suggests intentional placement within the broader system. The rhythmic signal becomes clearer again at this elevation, no longer perceived as a sound alone, but as a repeating spatial condition that manifests consistently across different points in the landscape. Jack now understands that the signal is not confined to a single origin. It is distributed through the environment itself, expressed through repetition, spacing, and alignment rather than direct emission. He steps closer to the edge of the platform, gripping the railing lightly as he studies the full breadth of the visible horizon. The forest is no longer perceived as an organic, chaotic system, but as a coordinated field of reference points, each one contributing to a larger structural continuity that extends beyond immediate sight. Shadow remains fully engaged, his attention fixed on the same distant axis, reinforcing the shared recognition between instinct and observation that has guided them from the ridge line to this elevated position. Jack begins to perceive that the fire tower is not an isolated structure, but part of a larger network of elevated observation points, each potentially positioned to capture and align with the same underlying system of environmental patterns. The wind shifts again across the platform, and for a brief moment, the horizon settles into an almost unnatural stillness. In that stillness, Jack recognizes that what he is witnessing is not a new phenomenon being uncovered, but a long-existing structure of order embedded within the landscape itself, waiting only for the correct perspective, elevation, and awareness to be fully understood. Jack Turner remains at the upper platform of the fire tower, his awareness now fully synchronized with the elevated perspective that has revealed the forest below as a distributed system of alignment points rather than a random natural environment. The earlier uncertainty has completely dissolved, replaced by a structured clarity that continues to expand as he observes more distant sections of the horizon. The wind moves in steady currents around the tower, passing through the wooden beams and metal framework, producing a subtle layered resonance that remains consistent with the rhythmic signal embedded throughout the landscape. Shadow stands on the lower platform without movement, his posture unchanged, but his focus now extending far beyond the immediate surroundings, locked onto the same distant directional axis that Jack has been tracking since they reached elevation. There is no tension in the dog's stance, only continuous certainty, as if the entire system of signals has already been interpreted through instinct alone. Jack slowly scans the horizon again, noticing that the previously identified alignment points are not isolated markers, but part of a broader distributed pattern that extends across multiple ridgelines and forest breaks. Each formation maintains consistent spacing relative to the others, suggesting intentional coordination rather than natural coincidence. The mist continues to move through the valleys in structured streams, and for the first time, Jack sees that these streams themselves are participating in the same directional logic, flowing in alignment with the spatial framework he is now able to recognize. He adjusts his stance slightly, gripping the railing as his perception continues to stabilize around the full scale of the system. Shadow suddenly shifts his head again, this time aligning with a more distant section of the horizon that had previously blended into background terrain. Jack follows immediately, refining his focus and identifying a subtle but distinct variation in elevation and forest density that mirrors the structural pattern seen in other regions. It is not visually prominent, but its placement confirms repetition within the larger framework. The rhythmic signal they have been following becomes even more defined at this altitude, no longer perceived as a sound in isolation, but as a consistent spatial condition embedded across multiple zones of the environment. Jack now understands that the signal is not emitted from a single source, but distributed through structural repetition, expressed through terrain alignment, atmospheric movement, and elevation-based resonance. He steps closer to the edge of the platform, allowing his view to encompass the widest possible range of the horizon. The forest below is no longer interpreted as a continuous organic mass, but as a structured field of interconnected points, each contributing to a larger geometric logic that extends beyond immediate perception. Shadow remains fully engaged, maintaining alignment with the same distant axis, reinforcing the shared awareness between instinct and observation that has guided their entire ascent. Jack begins to recognize that the fire tower is not an isolated observation structure, but one node within a broader network of elevated positions, each potentially serving as a reference point within this distributed system. The wind passes through once more, and for a brief moment, the entire horizon appears to settle into a unified stillness. In that stillness, Jack realizes that what he is witnessing is not the discovery of something newly formed, but the revelation of an existing structure that has always been present, embedded within the landscape, and waiting only for the correct elevation, perspective, and alignment of perception to be fully understood. Jack Turner remains at the upper platform of the fire tower, his final moments of observation unfolding under a sky that now feels unusually still, as if the entire landscape has entered a state of suspended awareness. The structured alignment he has been tracking across the horizon no longer feels like separate points of interest, but like a complete system finally understood in full continuity. Every ridge line, every valley opening, and every subtle variation in forest density now resolves into a coherent, distributed framework that spans far beyond immediate visibility. The wind moves gently through the tower, passing through its worn wooden beams and metal joints, producing a soft resonance that continues to match the underlying rhythmic signal that has been present since their ascent began. Shadow remains on the lower platform, perfectly still, his body oriented toward the same distant axis that now defines the entire visual field. There is no movement in him that suggests uncertainty or anticipation. Instead, there is completion, as if the journey of interpretation has already reached its conclusion through instinct alone. Jack slowly lowers his gaze across the vast horizon one final time. The forest below is no longer interpreted as fragmented terrain, but as a unified, structured field, where alignment points are distributed in a consistent pattern that extends across distance, elevation, and atmospheric flow. The mist continues to drift through valleys and controlled streams, but now it is clear that these movements are not random environmental behavior. They follow the same underlying logic that governs the spatial distribution of the landscape itself. He exhales slowly, feeling the weight of realization settle into a stable understanding rather than a moment of discovery. The fire tower beneath him is no longer just an elevated structure. It is a reference node within a broader system of observation points, each one positioned to reveal the same underlying framework from different perspectives. Shadow suddenly shifts his head one final time, aligning with a point far beyond the visible horizon. Jack follows this adjustment and sees no new structure, yet understands that visibility is no longer the determining factor. The system he is observing is not defined by what can be seen, but by what is consistently aligned across all observed points. The rhythmic signal that has accompanied them throughout their journey stabilizes into a final consistent state, no longer fluctuating but fully integrated into the perception of space itself. Jack tightens his grip on the railing briefly, not out of tension, but out of recognition that there is nothing further to resolve. The pattern is complete. The fire tower, the forest, the path, and the distant alignments are all part of a single continuous structure that has now revealed itself entirely through elevation, perspective, and sustained attention. Shadow remains motionless below, his presence reinforcing the final realization that no further movement is required. Jack slowly steps back from the edge of the platform, his understanding no longer expanding but settling into clarity. The forest remains vast, silent, and unchanged in form, yet entirely transformed in meaning. In that final moment of still observation, Jack understands that the journey was never about reaching the tower. It was about reaching the perspective from which everything hidden within the landscape could finally be seen as it truly is.